everyone, it's the Steve Padilla Sessions with me, Kevin Pang from America's Test Kitchen, Baxter Holmes, NBA senior writer for ESPN, and Steve Padilla, column one editor for the Los Angeles Times. Gentlemen, it's been a hot minute since we've seen each other. We sort of took a brief summer hiatus here, but we are back. And for a lot of us, it's back to school time, and we figured we wanted to return to the basics. And there was one Twitter thread in particular that Steve wrote. Actually, it was the beginning of, I think it was the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2020.
It was a New Year's resolutions.
It was a New Year's resolution top 10 list for editors, and it went viral. Steve broke the internet and he broke Twitter. And so we figured we're going to take this time to revisit some of those little pearls of wisdoms about editing. And these were top 10 items for any editor's 2021 to-do list. So I figured we're just going to go through each one of them, briefly talk about each one, and then hear you hopefully expound upon them and talk a little bit more. So let's go to the first one here. So
what the heck did I write? What did it say?
I'll remind you, Steve, right here. Okay. All right. Here's the first one. It's the resolution for editors number 1. To remember it's not your byline on the story. Also ask yourself, quote, am I making this better or just different? Steve, please help me feel better about myself.
Yes, that notion of, am I making it better or am I making it different? I think we've all had that experience as writers where you look at it and it's not necessarily worse than it was before, but it's not appreciably better either. All I can tell you is it's just different. And I think that comes from editors who just feel that they have to, that it has to be their voice. And I don't even know if they're aware that they're doing that. But that drives me crazy. Baxter here.
One thing I want to chime in on real quick. I mean, I think the elephant in the room a little bit right now is that we live in a day and age where there's a lot of shrinking in media. Jobs are being cut. People are having to try to prove their value, their worth, why they should be kept versus somebody else being laying off. Obviously, we're coming through a pandemic when there's been even more tightening of the belt, so to speak. But I mean, for my entire lifetime in media, this has been true. There's just been a shrinkage of the staffs and whatnot. And I think this feeling of I need to prove that I am valuable, that I make an impact, that I make a difference is hanging over a lot of people's heads. And I do think that this notion that you're talking about, Steve, has probably been around for a long time. But I feel like the economics of the current media environment probably can make it more pronounced in some ways. The other thing go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry for you. I think you really hit on something about what the motivation is, unconscious, and it's not just, wanting to put their voice in it because some editors have this idea, well, it's not how I would say it.
Yeah.
Well,
the other thing that I would point out here quite quickly is I think that particularly for high profile stories or projects that say there's a bunch of editors involved, and Steve, you'd be able to speak to this.
Yeah.
I think that there's times where you can have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and sometimes it can be really good. And I think other times you have certain editors who maybe they're jockeying for seniority, or there's a totem pole or office politics, and each one of them kind of wants to make their own mark in a way, and in so doing can kind of take away from the story. They're not necessarily making it better, but they're I don't know, they're kind of trying to put their own stamp on it in a way. And again, these are office politics things. These are the dynamics in some ways of like high profile stories, projects. Look, you work on column 1, it's the most high profile story in the LA Times every single day.
Well, I think,
anyway,
it's interesting. I think that I can't even articulate how I've spotted this, but there've been times where I've seen a story and you read it and you think that's been through a lot of editors. I don't even know how I know. And sometimes it's because it lacks voice and it lacks personality. It's because it maybe has too many in there fighting for the spotlight. I don't even know how I can express how I've spotted that. I'd be curious if anyone watching wanted to share comments about if you've had that or if you've known. One thing I always admired with one of my predecessors in column one here at the Times is an editor by the name of Roger Smith. Baxter, you'll remember working with him, and Kevin too, right? I think you both worked with Roger. Roger is very confident in his abilities. He's not cocky, but very confident. So he actually would do nothing sometimes. And it takes a lot of, I think it takes a lot of confidence to do nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
I mean, to piggyback on that point, Steve. So, was there ever a point in your career where you shifted from a mindset of, okay, I'm going to edit this to make this sound better, and perhaps subconsciously not realizing you're editing in your voice, versus helping strengthen the voice of the writers that you're editing?
I'm not sure when that happened, but that definitely became my thing. I was heavily influenced, this is gonna sound so wonky, but I was heavily influenced by a biography of a great editor, the immortal Max Perkins. I remember reading that in college. The book is, by the way, for those who haven't read it, let's see, Maxwell Perkins, Editor of Genius by A. Scott Berg. And Perkins was Scribner's editor, and he was the editor of Hemingway, of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Thomas Wolfe, among others. And so anyway, he, in that book, in that biography, it became a movie too, by the way, a few years ago called Genius, I think.
A very good one, yeah.
Yeah, with Editor as Hero, perfect movie. And his philosophy was the book belongs to the writer, and that it was his goal to kind of to bring out the writer's voice. And I know that, at least in nonfiction, we have certain restrictions in journalism and stuff like that. But I've kind of absorbed that. One of my favorite quotes in the book from Perkins was, he said, an editor creates nothing, which I didn't quite agree with. But what I did agree with was the last part of the quote where he says, an editor releases energy. That's the verb he used, releases energy. And I just think that's like, if you're doing it right, that's what you're doing. And in fact, I think this top 10, these 10 resolutions go towards that notion of releasing the energy. I can't give it to you, but I can help your energy kind of get out there.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue to go to resolution 2. And actually resolution 2 and 3 are, it's a two-parter. So we get 2 for the price of 1 here.
Okay, yes.
Read the 2. It's to be positive. Quote, when you find a gem in the 20th paragraph, don't say, you buried the lead. Say, this part is so good, we got to move it up. Let me add that to number 3, part 2. Imagine you're editing a poorly organized story, but find a few paragraphs that do flow. Build on that. You can say, quote, this part has good transitions, but others not so much. Whatever you're doing here, do it everywhere. So much of writing, Steve, is really about, stroking the bellies of writers and making sure that they don't feel, their egos aren't bruised so much, right?
Oh, God, yeah. Okay, well, the first one was the notion of, rather than say you buried the lead, this is so good, we got to move it up. That was my advice there. And I know when I tweeted that out, some people said, oh, you're sugarcoating it, can't people take criticism? I'm like, well, but the thing is, that's the truth, because I've run into stuff that's low that is just really wonderful. And it doesn't mean that the stuff that was at the top wasn't good. It probably was pretty good, but this was just even better. So, I think when you say, this is so good, we just got to move it up, the reporter absorbs it, it's a little compliment, and then they get on board. And frankly, just from an editing perspective, they're less resistant. But the other key thing is, it doesn't mean that you cut from the story that original lead or that thing that's really high, that's good. Because if it's that good, you probably want it in the story anyway. I'm just talking about moving it somewhere else. And the next one was related. What was that one? That was the.
That is about, imagine you're editing a poorly organized story, but find a few paragraphs that do flow, build on it. It's this notion of sort of yes-anding.
Yeah, okay. So I was just talking to an editor about this today, actually. A buddy of mine called me. He's a new editor, and he's working with a reporter who really has organizational issues. And so I was telling him how I've dealt with a reporter who had that before. Is I said, well, one basic thing, and I know you guys are really into this, is one way to make stories flow is just, it sounds simple, but it's not. make sure the end of one sentence relates to the beginning of the next one. Right? I mean, it's harder than it sounds. And so what I told him was, if her stories aren't flowing, first of all, diagnose why. And it's probably because the ends of her sentences aren't setting up the beginnings of the next sentence. Okay. So that's one way to detect flow. But to go to the coaching tip here is, when I've had people that had poor flow in their stories, I'll look them over, hoping to find some place where it does flow really well. And often you will find that. It might just be one paragraph to the other, or if you're lucky, it might be 3 or 4 in a row. And it may be entirely luck that this happened. They don't know what they're doing, but it flows. What you can do as an editor, you can say, see this section here where it flows really well, and you can point out why. And it's generally, relates to the beginning, ends of sentence. You say, see, this flows really beautifully. This is terrific. Now look over here. And then you show the section that doesn't flow as well. I refer to those sections as ones with speed bumps, where the stories don't come to a complete halt. They're not that badly organized, but the connections aren't that smooth. So there's like these little speed bumps, in the parking lot that slow you down a bit. And so what I'll do is I'll say, now look at here, see, and then they'll be able to see that this doesn't flow as well as this one. And so then the coaching thing is, you say, so you know how to do this, just do it everywhere.
Great.
Which is different than saying, don't have bad flow. I mean, what is, what does that mean?
Right.
Have I used anything like that on you guys? I'm trying to, I don't know if I pulled that
look,
on
I can think of several instances, and Kevin probably has as well, where I worked with you on a story, Steve, and in an email or in a Google document or something, you would highlight things that you really liked. And I wanted to go back to something that Kevin said, and I'll try to be as quick as I can here. A lot of the very best writers I know are some of the most, like you talked about stroking their egos, but they're some of the most insecure, like just lacking in confidence. They could have a shelf full of awards and honorifics and whatnot, but they still, when they're staring at that blinking cursor, it's this feeling of, I don't know if I can do this. Maybe I'm no good. Maybe this is the story that breaks me, that everyone finds out that I'm a fraud, all this other stuff. I see tweets from writers who I deeply admire all the time, every day. I just saw one not 20 minutes ago where this person was like, I can't, I'm really, really struggling right now. And I think that, for a lot of people who are aspiring to do very great work, there is this like constant struggle the whole time. I think Tom Junod said something of like the writing process is, I'm terrible, I'm great, I'm terrible, I survived. From like the rough draft to the first edit to the next draft to then it being published, and that's this feeling, I survived. And I think when you hit send on that rough draft to the editor, no matter how much you've talked through the story, there's this like, oh man, like this hesitation, this fear, this, oh, this is terrible, I don't know. Like, I mean, you might have good stuff, but like, so even just a little bit of encouragement, and the wait to get the reply from the editor that they even received the email or their thoughts on the first draft feels like an eternity. Yeah. And you're just nervous about what that first sentence is. It's probably like kids, they open up the, their college application or like I applied to Harvard, and they get you're like, what is that first sentence? It's like, oh, we regret to inform you. It's like, oh, damn it, I didn't get in.
Yeah.
So anyways, there's absolutely that feeling. I'll let Kevin weigh in on this as well, but just a little bit of encouragement. Even if you just like something in the 20th paragraph,
well, that's why
you think it's a nice detail, really goes a long way.
Well, that's why another technique, and I know you guys have seen this. What I like to do is, when I'm adding something to a story, I'll put it in a color, like green or bold or something like that. And then I'll use strike through to delete words. But then when I'm putting in comments or questions, I tend to put them in caps so they don't look like anything else, and I highlight them in yellow so they don't get measured. Okay, so. But the thing is, I don't want people to associate yellow with negativity, because yellow doesn't just mean questions. So they'll see in caps in yellow, love this, period, or, this cracks me up, or nice, or whatever. And I don't do this constantly, that can be a little disingenuous, but the basic message is, don't associate the yellow with everything bad or questions.
Great.
And so I'll throw that in there.
That's why we love working with Steve, right, Bax?
Amen.
Yeah. All right. Love that.
Okay, number 4.
Let's move into number 4. And this is about William Faulkner's Nobel lecture on the role of the writer. Quote,
yes.
Steve, just 557 words. Oh, that last paragraph. We'll put a link here to the Twitter thread and also to Faulkner's Nobel lecture. But what do you remember about that last paragraph, which begins with this sentence: I refuse to accept this. I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. Lastly, the poets, the writers' duty is to write about these things. And he goes on after that. Steve, why does that paragraph, and there is more to it, why does that paragraph resonate with you?
Well, you have to remember that this was in the 50s, and the threat of nuclear war was very present in everyone's minds, that the world would just be all blown up. And so he kind of addresses that in this speech. But he really talks about the duty of the writer to write about, I think, what he calls the old verities, the old truths, and really address human stories, and he has this great sentence there, that we should write about love and honor and betrayal and trust. And it's a whole lovely selection of words there. And there's a great line in there. And I even remember being moved by this, like in high school, maybe when I first read this. And he says, when he was complaining about people who don't really write about the human condition, he says something like, they don't write of the heart, they write of the glands, which I just think is just a great line. They write of the glands. And so that last paragraph is really one very much of hope. And it also is just beautifully written. But it's a reminder of what is the role of the writer. And I know he was really talking about, fiction, but I think a lot of what he says in that applies to journalism, applies to nonfiction in many respects. It's just beautifully written.
Yeah.
By the way, so I was curious to hear him read it. And so I actually found a recording on YouTube of him reading it, and it's just terrible. He could write, but he couldn't talk. I mean, he just like mumbling the whole thing. You don't understand what the heck he's saying.
Yeah.
It was a tremendous disappointment.
But on the page,
it was a tremendous disappointment.
It's a beautifully pithy and just full of brevity, and just a really lovely speech.
Oh, it's great.
So,
great. Yeah. It's not like his novels. I mean, it's actually very concise.
Exactly right. All right, here we go. Number 5, to use this trick if you're moving an excellent phrase, sentence, or paragraph. Don't just leave it in strike through, which makes the writer think you're deleting the gem. Add a note, not cut, just moved. This, you were just mentioning this before. This happened today.
This happened today. I was moving down fairly high in the story. There was this neat detail. It wasn't a quote, it was a detail. And I put it in strike through. And I just knew that the reporter would think, what the hell is he doing? This is like terrific. And so I put in yellow caps, not cut, just moved. So that way they knew I hadn't lost my mind, And so I think this is especially valuable if you're moving something down, because if it's like a long piece, like Bax, have you had this, an editor move something, but you don't know if they've moved it or cut it,
Yeah, absolutely. And then you're like Command F, like trying to, all right, I know what keyword was there. You're like looking through the story to find it. And then if you can't find it, then there's, and I think every writer, there's certain parts of a story you can maybe be too in love with that don't belong there. But then there's also things that, in your heart of heart, in your gut, that need to be in the story, that are like damning details or powerful details or whatever the case may be. And so, yeah, sometimes they get moved and, maybe you don't get told, or they get cut and you don't get told, and there's no explanation. It's just like, zip, and you just, anyways, and then thus panic attack.
Yeah. So this eliminates freakouts. And I actually tweeted this today because and then some people saw one editor reply, hey, this is a good technique, I'll use it. Yeah. So if you move, and it's not like you need to write a long sentence explaining your edit. I mean, I literally just wrote, not cut, just moved. It didn't take me a lot of time to do this, but it would prevent, because otherwise she would have thought I'd lost my mind, because it really is a very wonderful little detail.
I remember more than once when an editor would cut a line or detail that I love so much, and I would not realize it was cut until after it was published. Now that just filled me with dread. So anyway, don't do that.
Don't do that.
You don't do that. So all right, okay, we're halfway home. Let's go to resolution number 6. To resist the urge to say, we already did that. Encourage new angles or ways to tell familiar tales. Don't let your desk, office, or Zoom call be the place where ideas come to die. Basically, what we're trying to say is just be open-minded, because every idea has been done before, but there's always sort of new angles and approaches that you can take.
Yeah, actually, you really seem to be nodding your head. Do you have an example or something like that?
This defines you in such a wonderful way, Steve. And I think, Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, you've probably been asked by people, maybe college classes, where do you come up with your ideas and whatnot? And I have as well. One of the things I hearken back to things that Steve has taught me, but a lot of it's about being open-minded. And then even if I perhaps had an idea or saw something and maybe it was something that had kind of been done before, Steve was open-minded enough to try to see if there was a way we could spin that idea on its head, maybe look at it at a different angle or some kind of way, especially if he saw that like I was really passionate about it, or I thought there was something really good there, or hey, maybe explore it or something. But Steve was very open. Like Steve, I think, was trying to find a way towards yes, than trying to, and the best avenue towards yes, I should say, than trying to find the fastest no. And right. I want Steve to take it from there.
Okay. Actually, we can share an example of this, Bax. You proposed writing a story about a place that has been written about like 5 million times. You were going to be in New York, and you said, "Hey, I want to write about McSorley's. Is it McSorley's Tavern? Is that the proper name of the bar?
Something like that. It's a bar. Yeah. It's one of the oldest bars, and not the oldest bar in New York, and that's one of the oldest.
Yeah, it's been around like since the Civil War. And you wanted to write. So you come to me and say, "I want to write about McSorley's." And part of me thinks, "Oh, geez, how do we, But again, I don't want to be the place to have my desk be where the ideas come to die. And so we started kicking it around, and we came up with an idea. But then when you actually got there, you stumbled across something completely different, which totally worked, which oddly enough related to what we talked about was we said, maybe the fact that it's been written about 1 million times is the story, and we thought, that we could get around that, get another McSorley story. Well, yes, because everyone writes about it. And we were thinking, would we quote some famous guy on McSorley's? But then while you're there, you discovered a writer.
Yeah, the longtime bartender was a poet, and had actually published. He lived above the bar and had published books of poetry about the bar, and was actually working on a second volume. And to that point, so one of the things about Steve, and I know this is true of Kevin as well, Steve does trust his reporters. That we can discuss an idea, we can kind of hash it out. But I also know that when you're on the scene, you have the eye for detail, for maybe seeing what a better story is. In part, that's because you trained us, Steve. So when we're out there, we're kind of an extension of you anyway. And so there's trust there, knowing that, hey, Kevin Pang is really good. I trust that if he walks into a room, he's probably going to find the best story there, period. And that's just because Kevin's great. I worked with Kevin. Kevin knows what he's doing. He's a pro. I trust him, that kind of thing. So anyways, that's that's you.
One last thought on putting on this. This is something the reporter's responsibility if you're pitching. So if you are bringing up a subject that indeed your magazine, paper, whatever, has covered 1 million times, I think it's important to make it clear to the editor, that. So you say, okay, hey, I've got this idea about like an LA classic, the Rose Parade. But I know we've written 1 million things on the Rose Parade, but this is different. Let me tell you what it is. So if you acknowledge that this is like an old chestnut, then maybe they'll be more receptive to listen to you. Otherwise, if they just hear Rose Parade, they just zone out. So that could be a helpful pitching device.
Funny enough, all of us who were MetPros is the program for sort of minority journalists starting out. Every single year there's a tradition of assigning us to cover the Rose Parade.
Yes, indeed.
So there's a story every single year about that. So that's
yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Two notes about that. You talk about McSorley's Old Ale House. Probably one of the best books of nonfiction is Up in the Old Hotel. That's Joseph Mitchell's book, the New Yorker writer. That's just a fantastic book. And I'll add one more thing about this is sort of an example of Steve taking a chance. Ultimately, this was never published, but I did report on a story, Steve, I'm not sure you remember, during my last days at the LA Times, where I went to a Costco and I talked to the old ladies who were giving out free samples of food. And I tried to do a story there. Ultimately, I don't think I can quite nail it, but that was an example of Steve saying, you know what, just go for it. And I always
it was about the people grazing and the people who serve the little weenies and the food samples and stuff like that. I think you're like your fellowship was wrapping up. I mean, if we'd had a few more days, you would have been able to, go back a little more reporting and do it.
Well,
I still love that idea.
Maybe it's worth another column one.
or America's Test Kitchen.
There you go. Exactly. All right, let's move on to the next one here. This is resolution number 7: to resist the urge to automatically trim every adjective and adverb. True, you probably should cut most of them, but consider their intent and meaning. If they truly reflect the reporting, why not use them? I love this. Please expound on that, Steve.
I don't know. Maybe I want to hear Baxter. I mean, I've seen editors who just automatically cut like adverbs, and I think generally speaking, you probably don't need them. But to me, it always comes back to what's the meaning. I mean, I think some have really specific meanings. One I'll cite, often in lectures is the adverb apologetically, as in like he said apologetically. When you use that, they're not literally apologizing. It's the kind of word you'd see in a quote like, I only went to school through 3rd grade, he said apologetically. Like I say, he's not literally apologizing as in the sense of forgive me, but there's this unique meaning to that word. And I can't think of a verb that quite captures that same idea. So to me, it comes down to, what's the meaning? There was a guy, a reporter and editor in our Washington Bureau, former foreign correspondent named Bob Drogan, who used tons of adjectives. I'd never really noticed that till one time I was reading a weather story of all things. It was a national weather roundup. It was a terrific read. Normally you wouldn't care about those kinds of stories, but he just wrote the hell out of it. And when I looked at it, I realized, oh my God, there are adjectives all over the place. But they didn't stand out like a sore thumb because Bob is a real wordsmith and they were woven in there. So Baxter, I mean, have you had that issue of either trying to squeeze them back into stories or editors taking them out unreasonably?
I think I probably try to avoid them just out of habit because of the training and whatnot. But the point that I wanted to touch on here is like editing with intent, because I think that I don't want to speak for editors, but I think there's probably like, look, if it's, say you have X amount of space, it's 500 words, and it's like, oh, this is a 572 or something. All right, we got to cut. And you immediately just start going for those. And you're up against a deadline and you just go straight into like trim mode and versus being in intent mode. And I think one of the things that you always keep in mind, Steve, is the story. The story, for it to be the best version of itself, what needs to be in there. And I understand there can be space constraints here and there, but you got to be careful about going into just like cut mode too haphazardly because of this.
Although sometimes you do have to, I was again today, I was talking to a reporter and just telling him we've got to get some stuff out, and it's not an issue of this whether the stuff is good or bad. It's got to fit, and so we're just having to squeeze it. But the upshot is that I just don't think you should automatically say all adverbs and adjectives are bad. I just don't agree with that. It depends.
The other side of that coin, and it might not seem related, but I think one thing that I've definitely become as I've continued, my career writing is I become less married to the words and to the story. And I wonder if it's because I, started my career as a newspaper reporter, and then I went into, writing for the digital space where we would, sometimes publish 11, 12 stories a day. And I might sometimes write 2 or 3 of them. And when I publish something, I just look at it as, okay, this is my best effort. I'm just going to ship it and then it's gone. It's out the door. Right. So I've really learned to not be so married to words. And like, I find it very rare that I'll actually fight an editor over like the placement of one word, or it's just, to me, I just don't want to like put in the fight, but maybe that's just my character. Maybe that's why.
No,
I don't know. What do you think, Bax?
I think you do this long enough, you understand this is a process.
Yeah.
And there's give and take. There's some battles that are worth fighting, but a lot of them maybe aren't as important as you think they are. But yeah, I just come to accept that it's a process, like that from the first version of it to what is published. It's going to go through many iterations, and hopefully you're working with a good team that is trying to get that story to be the best version of itself. I'm like you, I'm not as married to the words, and I'm open to whatever needs to be changed, being changed or altered so that the story can be the best version of itself. And I don't want to get in the way of that.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, I'm sorry, you first, Kevin. Sorry.
I think one of the very quick point, one of the reasons why we do get to that is because we've been lucky in our careers to work with editors like Steve, which, we have placed our complete trust in Steve's hands. And, I know not every writer is lucky enough to say that or work with an editor like Steve, but, when I've just come to accept that when Steve offers a suggestion, most of the time, 99.9, hell, 100% of the time, right?
100. It's 100.
It's 100.
Oh, okay.
I trust you that it's going to be the right decision. So anyway,
but actually, you raised a very interesting thing, the notion of both of you of intent, and the interesting, it almost sounds like a contradiction here of I'm not as wedded to the words, but then that doesn't suggest that we don't care deeply about the words, because I think you can actually do both at the same time. Yeah. It's so anyone wondering about who heard you guys say that wonder, well, don't they care about the words? Yes, they do deeply.
Yeah.
But you can, to me, it always comes back to what's the idea. I think that the hardest things in writing are the structure and the theme. And and I'm always relieved when other editors read something I've handled and we all agree that works, or the reporter and I are on the same page. The words are, I know this is weird for people who struggle with writing, because we all do. In some ways, the words are the easy part, because you can change them so quickly compared to structure or theme, right? So in a weird way, the words are the easy part. I know that sounds really contradictory.
No, I love her enough to let her go. The same applies to words, right? Maybe not. I think I cribbed that from like some like rom-com that I just watched, possibly.
I like it.
Okay, all right, here we go. Number 8. This is a classic Steve Padilla-ism here. To dare your writers to end a feature story in their own voice, not a quote. Baxter, I know that's, this has just like been burned into our brains. And Steve, explain why, most of the time it just makes for a more compelling ending.
It's weird. It somehow feels more literary, without sounding highfalutin. And in some respects, it's not ceding the stage, to someone else, unless they, of course, can say it better than you can. I just think that it, well, here's the other thing. There's so many stories that always end with quotes.
Yeah.
That, and it's a thing of beauty. If you do have the perfect end quote, use it. So I'm not saying don't use them, but if you can use it, do it in your voice, it just somehow gives the story like a little more literary feel, a little more refined feel. And you can, well, actually, let me ask you back, because I know, I got you on board with that. When I first threw it at you, did that feel uncomfortable? Did you like embrace it? I don't remember, how it went for you to.
I think at that point, I just learned that you were an editing genius and to go along with whatever you said. But okay. I had come to see that so many stories. You picked up a newspaper any day, anywhere, and it seemed like in every one. The percentage of the ones that end with quotes, particularly I saw sports writing. It's like, oh, the last quote went to a player or the coach or something like that. It's just kind of an easy, I don't want to say lazy sign off, but you saw them so often. It just seemed like it was boilerplate structure in that way. But when I read amazing magazine stories from writers who I deeply admired, they would often end maybe on a powerful scene and that would be where it was at. And if it was a quote, I mean, holy hell, it was a quote. It was something that was like, stuck with you. And to your point, you mentioned this just a few minutes ago, like, unless you should be able to say it better than they can. Now, there's instances where somebody may say something that is just absolutely haunting, or whatever the case is, and then you give the stage to them at the end because there's no way you can say it better. But I had an editor once who said, like, we're paying you for your writing abilities. You better be able to say it better than most of the people you're talking to.
Ooh, that's great.
So that's kind of stuck with me a little bit. Like, this is my job.
Yeah.
But I think about that all the time, and there's so many stories I read that I really, really admire. And the percentage of the ones that ends in quotes are very, very few. So it's gospel to me as it is to Kevin. I don't know. Yeah, Kevin, did you take to it naturally? What were your thoughts?
Oh, of course. I mean, like, exactly what you said. Like, the reason why newspaper writers end in quotes is not because it's just the easy way. It's the reflexive way, right? And as soon as I read a story that ended in the writer's voice, it just seemed like, okay, why can't I aspire to that? There's an oft cited example that, Steve, I know you mentioned this in many of your lectures that you talk about, but I believe David Wharton wrote the story about Todd Marinovich, right? Do you remember the ending?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. David, I got David onto no quote endings some years ago. And basically I remember, and he almost never ends a story with a quote now, by the way. He's a terrific sports writer for the LA Times, just did some great work in the Olympics, by the way.
And we will link to a story that he wrote with one of our former guests, Nathan Fenno, about eating at a 7-Eleven in Tokyo.
Yes.
Wonderful story.
Great.
Yeah,
story.
I edited that one. Yeah. So
well, no surprise. So anyway,
and
remember that story about Todd Marinovich? Yeah,
Todd Marinovich, who was this quarterback, a pro quarterback who became, unfortunately, a major drug addict. And it was a story about his struggles with heroin and everything. And it ended originally with a quote from him where he basically said, because he was in like a 12-step program, and it was something like, well, I know it's going to be tough, but if I work hard, I can beat this thing. And I told Dave, it just didn't work for me because it was kind of cliche. I mean, they always say that in those programs. And I said, also, given everything you'd read before that, it really looked like Marinovich was on the knife's edge. You really couldn't tell if he was going to fall back into, drug use or succeed. As it turned out, he actually did really become, really more addicted on all sorts of things down the road. So anyway, David rewrote the ending, and he talked about how he gets him to admit that, it's a daily struggle. And then the last paragraph, David remembered something he told him. And see, I think I can almost recite it because it describes its action. And it says something like, while driving on his way to a meeting or practice, Marinovich often passes an off-ramp where he used to buy drugs. The urge arises, the exit sign beckons. That's the ending.
Yeah.
It's perfect.
Perfect. It's
and great. Dang, and I almost got that word for word, but it's darn close to that. And all I can tell you is, so I'll often read that, out loud in a lecture or something like that. And when I get to the end, usually the audience, there's like this gasp. I've told Dave, I said, usually the whole audience just gasps when I get to that ending. The urge arises, the exit sign beckons.
Mm-hmm. And it's the most honest ending, because
that's the other thing. It's more accurate.
He was struggling, and who knows?
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah.
Right.
You don't want to look, pardon my French, but you don't want to look like an ass because you're saying, oh, he's going to make it and he doesn't make it or whatever. You're kind of leaving it up in the air because it is up in the air. You never know.
Mm.
Anyway.
Yeah. And so, yeah, Kevin, if we can get the link and put that there, it's a hell of a read. Mm-hmm. But the other thing about that, one other quick thing, comment on that, it's the equivalent of a piece of music that ends on an unresolved chord, that story. Because usually we want things to resolve. We either want it to resolve, it turns out well, or it turns out badly. And stuff that's ambiguous isn't often considered good storytelling. Well, sometimes that is the point. And that was the case here. Mm-hmm. Just the way like a piece of music can sometimes end on something that's unsettling. Quick example on music, like consider the last phrase of Happy Birthday. Happy birthday to. It's really disturbing.
You know what?
Until you hear the resolution, that's really annoying, right?
I'm not sure if it was Mozart, but one of these like classic composers where like the way that this composer's wife would get him up in the morning was he would play the C scale all the way up to, but not all the way up to a B, but not the last note that resolves back to the C. And that's the way. And because he was like I forgot who it was, but because he felt like he had to like,
so annoying. You
up
have
to
to get
piano to like play that C because otherwise it won't be satisfying. Anyway, I love that. All
right. Yeah, no,
exactly.
that's
right.
really annoying. Yeah.
All right, we got two more. Let's try to go through these.
We'll wrap this up.
9. To write something under your own byline, just remember what it feels like to get edited.
Yeah.
Love that.
Well, a few years ago, I did this freelance piece for this education group, and I thought I did a pretty good job. I write this thing, I turn it in, but it that nervousness, Baxter, that you mentioned, didn't go away. And I'm thinking, I hope she likes it, and I hope she doesn't cut it. She liked the lead. I wrote a no quote ending. Oh, but speaking of that, by the way, that story, I struggled to find, and I did write a hell of an ending with it, but I did come up with a no quote ending because I thought if I ended with a quote, I would get such just, crap from, people who've heard me for years.
From the two of us.
So, but anyway, I was really, I wasn't panicked, but I was really wondering when she was going to read it and what she was going to say, and so that, so I think that's just a good reminder. Mm-hmm. So every blue moon, if you're an editor, you can write something and just remember the process. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that'd be very healthy. Yeah,
I love that. And here's the last one, which is sort of a really nice note to end on. To take care of yourself. You're probably not thanking them, so allow me to thank you now. This year reminded us that we can't control events. This was in 2020, of course, but we can control how we use language. Let's embrace it and try to have some fun along the way. Can you think of one example of how you've taken care of yourself, Steve, in the last year? I know it was a tough year for you and for everyone, but can you think of a way of self-care?
Yeah, I don't think I've done enough, frankly, but I think just generally speaking, just removing from the pandemic year, in my other life, I'm a musician, and despite what I just did with Happy Birthday, I actually do sing. And so when under normal conditions, I would religiously go to these rehearsals, and work on, as I always say, 50s music, the 1550s. And so that was really religious, no matter what was going on with the paper. I still do those. I think keeping in touch with family, keeping in touch with friends, and then, some of the other basics, exercise, eat right. And also, this is the other thing, is to actually disengage. My boss and I were talking about this the other day, about how unfortunately by working from home, you get this second wind and you start editing at 11 p.m., and that's really not that healthy. Although I have done some really good edits around midnight, but we agreed that should really be every now and then. We gotta watch it. Sometimes you just gotta force yourself to unplug.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of editors spend, just too much time, but so did writers. Spend too much time on the computer.
Same question to you. Give me just a way that you as a writer have try to take care of yourself.
Yeah, that's a good question. Exercise is a big part of my life, and I feel whether I'm going on a run or if I'm lifting weights or something, that I actually it's very, if I'm just focusing on that actually my brain is still kind of working on writing in the background. I'll get plenty of ideas, or or like, especially with reporting, like, I should reach out to this source, or this is an interesting detail, and I'll take like little notes or something while I'm doing it. I might stop my run and take a quick note on my phone or something. So, but disengaging is a big part of it. Quick story. There was a point earlier in my career when I had a great editor who reminded me a lot of Steve, who was telling me that to be your best, I need you to not be on all the time, right? You need to step away from this. You need to, because I was working on a story and I was grinding myself into dust. I was freaking out about every little thing. And he said, hey, I want you to get away from it. Turn your phone off, take a couple days, go, hang out, have dinner, go see a movie, whatever. I don't want to hear from you. Like, just disengage. For you to be the best employee that you can be, the best reporter and writer you can be, you need to be the best person. you can be, and to just, to be the healthiest person you can be. So anyways, those are my tips, but I think of that lesson a lot, as much as I honestly think about Steve's many lessons that have shaped me. But Kevin, I'm interested in yours.
Well, something I've done in the last year is taking walks in the woods. I really love that. I was reading this book called Deep Work by Cal Newport. We'll link that as well too. But one of the things he talks about is that there's a difference in how your brain engages walking through, say, like a city or a path that your brain is familiar with, even sort of in the background, versus just, walking through the woods where you're just like, not going in any sort of direction at all. And there's something really, really great. I'm lucky enough to sort of live north of the city here in Chicago, and there's some, nice wooded paths around me. And just walking, not just, walking around the neighborhood, but walking in the woods, I find to be a really great way of like disengaging. And so I think to Baxter's point, disengaging, that's really, really important. But
and yet oddly, while you disengage, that's when suddenly that lead comes to your mind.
Exactly.
Or the nut graph or the ending. Suddenly
the same reason why when you're that line comes when you're showering, or in the middle of the night.
Yes,
exactly. There's something the brain is doing that is not, it's your subconscious at work. So I really,
for me, it's brushing teeth or shaving that I get these, like something will hit me with a story. And I've learned now to put down the brush or the razor to quickly write it down. Otherwise, I will indeed forget it.
Yeah, and that we could tell.
I once had this idea in the car driving to work. Good thing it wasn't. This was surface streets, not freeways. And I pulled over to the curb so I could write it down because I just was afraid I was not going to remember it. And I couldn't like dictate it in anything at that point.
Yeah. Well, your 10 resolutions have resonated with a lot of people. It's resonated with us, and we will be posting this again in the comment section, and I'm sure Steve will retweet this as well. But anyway, if you have any questions at all, any comments, please feel free to leave it underneath here and tell your friends about this. But otherwise, Steve, Baxter, great to hear from you guys as always. And to the rest of you, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on the Steve Padilla Sessions.